Well, thank you so much for turning out. The subject we're talking about here is all of Canada's high-level radioactive nuclear waste, which shouldn't exist because nuclear energy is a clean technology. It's problem-free, so why is there nuclear waste? There shouldn't be anything, really. But in fact, this is a public relations term, that it's a clean technology. In fact, it produces the most toxic radioactive waste of any enterprise ever on the face of the earth. And what's more, the poisons that are created by nuclear power inside nuclear reactors are, most of them, indestructible. There's a handful that could be argued that you can figure out how to destroy, but most of them are indestructible, and they have a very long trajectory, millions of years, in fact. And since we don't know how to shut off radioactivity, we can't just neutralize the stuff and make it harmless. And that's the problem. So we have to keep it out of the environment. Now, for the first 30 years of the nuclear age in Canada, and also worldwide, the people who were making the big decisions, the people who were spending billions of dollars to build nuclear reactors, were unaware that this was a problem, because the nuclear industry never mentioned it. They never said it was a problem. They said this is a clean technology, and therefore, wow, who could be against it? You know, it's great. So, so that's the fairy tale, is it's a clean technology. Now, for 30 years, it was all hush-hush. But then, in the mid-1970s, people started speaking up. First of all, we had a report from Britain called the Flowers Report, by a nuclear physicist, by the way, Sir Brian Flowers. And in this report, which is a Royal Commission report for the British government, in 1976, he wrote, "We are agreed that it would be irresponsible and morally wrong to commit future generations to the consequences of fission power on a massive scale unless it has been demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that at least one method exists for the safe isolation of these wastes for the indefinite future." So that's really issuing an ultimatum to the nuclear industry. It's basically saying, put up or shut up. You know, if you're saying this is a clean technology, you've got to demonstrate that these wastes can be securely and safely isolated for millions of years from the environment of living things. Now, of course, human civilization is only, what, 5,000, 6,000 years old. So this is a problem that is trans-scientific and trans-historical. It goes beyond anything that the human race has ever had to deal with previously. And these wastes are not as old as I am. These wastes are only about 80 years old. I'm a little older than that. So, so I take priority. Anyway, the point is that they're going to bury me, but when they bury me, I'm going to decompose and become good fertilizer. This stuff is not going to disappear. This stuff is going to be there, available to poison the environment and to poison the drinking water and the food chain and the air for all that period of time. And the nuclear industry has said, when the whistle was blown by people like Sir Brian Flowers in '76, the industry said, oh yeah, nuclear waste, yeah, we didn't mention that, but actually it's not a problem because we know exactly what to do it. We're just going to bury it underground in an undisturbed geological formation, and that'll be it, no problem. We know geological formations that have been stable for hundreds of millions of years. So if we put the waste down there, it's going to be stable for another 100 million years, right? Problem is, they don't know how to get it into an undisturbed geological formation without disturbing it. So they have to dig down, they have to create pathways that didn't exist, and then they have to put it down there and hope it'll stay there. And then they want to plug the shaft that they built with material that is as strong as the original rock, and it's going to prevent anything from coming back up or finding cracking that's going to occurring as a result of the excavation and as a result of the dynamiting. And the other thing is that these wastes themselves are not inert. They're not inert. They're active. They're radioactive, meaning they give off radioactive emanations all the time. They're chemically active, and they're thermally active. They generate heat. The Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, who did the first environmental impact statement for the concept of geological disposal of radioactive waste, has a series of graphs that span a period of 50,000 years, showing how the heat of the wastes generated by the waste underground, this is 70-year-old waste. This is waste that's been out of the reactor and cooled already for 70 years before it's put underground. Then it proceeds to generate more heat, which heats up the rocks in a kind of what they call a thermal pulse. And the temperature of the rocks returns back to the original temperatures after about 50,000 years. And they call this period of 50,000 years the thermal pulse. A pulse, you know what a pulse is, a little heartbeat, a little tick on the graph. And that's because 50,000 years is nothing. Because the wastes are dangerous for 10 million years and more. So 50,000 years goes by like a wink of an eye. Anyway, this is basically the problem. Now, the year after the 1976 report in Britain, there was a 1977 report to the US Congress which said, quote, "The growth of nuclear power in the US is threatened by the problem of how to safely dispose of radioactive waste, potentially dangerous to human life. Nuclear power critics, the public, business leaders, and government officials all concur that a solution to the disposal problem is critical to the continued growth of nuclear energy." Now, the interesting thing here, if you'll notice, is that this is a threat to the growth of the nuclear industry, more so than a threat to the human civilization or to humans or to living things in general. So it's not so much the threat to the environment, although that's real, or the threat to human health, but the threat to the growth of the nuclear industry. So, because God knows an awful lot of effort has been put into nuclear power, billions and billions of dollars. 1 year later, in 1978, in Ontario, we had a Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning called the Porter Commission. And the Porter Commission issued a report in 1978 called A Race Against Time, which I think is a wonderful title. It's an interim report on nuclear energy in Ontario. And it says, quote, "The extreme lethality of a freshly removed spent fuel bundle is such that a person standing within a meter of one fuel bundle would die within an hour. For thousands of years, such bundles must be isolated from the Earth's ecosystem. If adequate progress is not being made, say, by 1985, the nuclear power should be reassessed and a moratorium on additional nuclear stations should be considered." So what this really is a shot over the bow to the nuclear industry. It's saying, look, you didn't tell us about this problem. Now we found out about it. You better darn well solve it. If you can't solve that problem, no more nuclear power. That's essentially the message. Now, that message has not been taken to heart by the Canadian government or by the US government or by many other governments around the world, but that's what the message was, clearly, from these reports. So the question is, why are these wastes so dangerous, and why do they even exist in this clean technology? Where do they come from? So I think it's important to understand a little bit about the origins of this stuff. It all begins with uranium. Uranium is the only element found in nature that can be used to either build an atomic bomb, such as the one that was destroyed Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, or to fuel a nuclear reactor. So the only element naturally occurring on Earth is uranium for any fission technology. So it's the key element behind all fission technology. And by the way, outside of nuclear fission, there's virtually no other use for uranium except as a pottery glaze. And they use depleted uranium munitions, which are pretty horrible in various conflicts in the world today, leaving a radioactive legacy on the battlefield, by the way, which is eternal. But at any rate, there really are no other uses for uranium of significance than nuclear weapons and nuclear reactors. Now, how do you get a nuclear weapon out of uranium? Well, you have to undergo a very sophisticated process called uranium enrichment. And it's not easy. It's a difficult problem. The reason why is because there's two isotopes of uranium, forms of uranium, which are virtually identical. They behave chemically the same way. So that if you have any chemical process that puts uranium on one side, all of the uranium goes on that side. You don't separate the good uranium, which is the explosive uranium, the U-235, that you can make a bomb from. But most of it, 99.3% of natural uranium is not the explosive kind of uranium. It's a non-explosive kind called U-238. It's also called depleted uranium sometimes. So the only way they can make a bomb is by very painstakingly increasing the percentage of U-235 to get it up to about 90% or 80% at least. Maybe 70% will do. But they got to get it up high before they can make any nuclear explosive of it. And that means they have to discard a lot of that other stuff, which is called depleted uranium. So that's basically where the weapons comes from uranium. But early on, they discovered something different. They discovered that instead of making a bomb, you can use the uranium to do a controlled chain reaction inside a machine called a nuclear reactor. And when you do that, something remarkable happens. Good for the bomb makers. And that is that the uranium that was bad stuff, the no good for bombs, U-238, 99.3% of the original uranium, right? It gets transformed into a new element called plutonium. Plutonium is not found in nature. If you go around the world looking for plutonium, the only place you'll find it is where mankind has made it. And that's in nuclear reactors, spent fuel pools, or spent fuel storage sites. And if they bury it underground, it's going to be down there in the underground repository. Because that plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. It's going to be here for a long, long time. As my friend Bob Del Tredici says, he says that when you look at nuclear power objectively, you realize that the real product of a nuclear reactor, the real products are plutonium, which goes on for hundreds of thousands of years, and the high-level waste, which lasts for millions of years. And what you get is a little blip of electricity for a couple of decades, a few decades, maybe 4 decades if you're lucky, you know, maybe less. Anyway, so we have a little blip, and then we have a forever headache with the plutonium, because thousands of years from now, somebody can go to the waste from a nuclear power plant that was built today and shut down tomorrow, and they can take that plutonium and use it to make atomic bombs. So we're actually creating atomic bomb material every time we produce high-level radioactive waste. That's not the environmental or the health problems, although, you know, plutonium is extremely toxic as well. It's one of the most toxic radioactive materials when ingested into the body. But that's not the main worry about plutonium. The main worry is that it can be used to make arsenals of weapons. So now, well, how does Winnipeg come into this? How does Manitoba come into this? Well, it turns out that after this 1978 report from the Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning in Toronto, the nuclear industry said, God, we really got to get working on this. And the government of Canada collaborated with the government of Ontario, and they embarked upon a $700 million research project to try and demonstrate, because that's the word that they used, demonstrate. But they didn't say demonstrate, they said validate. To validate, to confirm the geological disposal concept. So that's what the $700 million 15-year research project, and that brought AECL, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, here to Manitoba. They were already here because they had established a research center at Pinawa on the Winnipeg River, and they had a nice research community going on there. They were given the lead job of investigating and demonstrating or trying to validate the concept of safe isolation of this radioactive waste. So here in Manitoba is where the real work began of trying to validate it. And the reason they came to Manitoba is because they were chased out of northwestern Ontario. They went to Atikokan, they went to Massey, Ontario, they went to a dozen different communities in northern Ontario, and everywhere they went, they were chased out. They said, no, we will not give you permission to drill here, because if you drill here, you're probably going to put the waste here too, and we don't want the waste, so no thank you. And so what AECL did is they tried and tried and tried and got rejected, and they slipped across the border into Manitoba and very quietly acquired Crown land near Lac du Bonnet, in between Pinawa and the Whiteshell Nuclear Research Center. and excuse me, the actual land was in between Lac du Bonnet and Pinoy. And so that's where they built an underground repository about 500 meters deep. And in fact, Ann Lindsay took us on a tour of that underground repository. We had to wear rubber boots because the pumps were going all the time down in this rocky, excavated cavern. And I asked somebody, one of the AECL guys, they said, if you stop the pumps, how long would it take for this thing to fill up with water? He said, oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure. Maybe a few weeks, maybe a month or two. But there's no doubt that it's going to fill up with water. And the reason for that is fundamental, is because the actual cavity that you build is atmospheric pressure, but the rocks are at geological pressure. In other words, they're at enormous pressure. And this atmospheric cavity, all the water that is in the pores of the rock gets squeezed into that cavity, and it's going to fill up with water. There's no doubt about it. And the only problem is, of course, that water can be a vehicle for getting the waste out again if it has a pathway by which it can emerge. And particularly, as I told you about the heat being generated by these wastes, if the heat were able to produce steam by boiling water, for example, then the steam would give you a force that could possibly push this water out again into the environment. And so it's rather a complicated problem. There's also chemistry, because radioactivity is what's called ionizing energy. Ionizing energy means it breaks molecules, and when molecules are broken, they don't disappear. They reunite in random ways, and you get chemical reactions occurring that would not normally happen because of the radioactivity. So the radioactivity is a great catalyst, you might say, for chemical reactions. This was demonstrated just not so many years ago, around 2000, and when was it again, the WIP project explosion?
2014 was the explosion.
2014, yeah. 2014, there's only a few places on Earth where they've actually built underground storage facilities for radioactive waste, and several of them have failed. This is not for the high-level radioactive waste, which is the most dangerous stuff, but only for what's called the low and intermediate level waste. In Germany, they had one that was operating for many years called the Acid 2 salt mine facility. They had an abandoned salt mine, and they turned it into a radioactive waste repository for low and intermediate level waste. They put it down there, and after a while, it was leaking into the groundwater and into the surface water. And for 10 years, the people in charge never told the government or the public that it was actually leaking, because why? It's bad PR. It makes you look bad. It doesn't make nuclear energy look good, and it also doesn't make you look good if you're in charge of it. So therefore, this is a problem too. Will they tell you when things go wrong if their job depends on it going right? Right? So there's a problem here of having a possible conflict of interest, where you're not really only interested in safety, but you're interested in something else as well, which is the well-being of the industry. Yeah?
Would there be proposed legislative or regulatory requirements that would need to be met, and inspections and things like that?
Who are you,
You
sir?
would think that would be.
Would you mind identifying yourself?
Pardon me?
Would you mind identifying yourself?
Yeah, I'm Colin Morris.
Okay, and, okay. Well, yeah, there is regulatory agencies that look into these things. The problem is that they also are accused by official government agencies. There was, when the Liberal government built the new radioactive, Environmental Impact Act, which is now in force, they exempted nuclear facilities up to a certain stage for all environmental assessment. So when they build, for example, these so-called small modular reactors, as long as they're not too big, they don't have to undergo any environmental impact assessment at all. That's because of lobbying not only from the industry, but also from the regulatory agency. Now the funny thing is that you might think, well, why would the regulatory agency be doing that? Well, both the industry and the regulatory agency want to solve this problem. Because if they can't solve this problem, they're both out of a job. So the industry needs to solve the problem so they can end their liability and say, beyond a certain point, it's no longer our problem, it's your problem. And the regulatory agency, likewise, wants to be able to say, we're going to give you, and this is the word they use, we're going to give you a license to abandon. And once they give a license to abandon, they themselves as regulators are no longer responsible for maintaining active regulation of that. So there is a kind of a unity of purpose between the regulator and the industry, which is not always apparent from the outside. They also both report to the same minister, the Minister of Natural Resources, which is the only minister that is charged with promoting nuclear power. So there's a kind of a built-in conflict of interest there. And we, Bernane and myself and other people who've dealt with the industry regulation for many, many years, have found that, that they seem to be a captive regulator. They seem to be pretty much a creature of the industry. And of course, there are some very good people on staff. They do good research and so on. But the top people who are running the show in the CNSC have never once failed to grant a license to a major nuclear facility. Every time they're asked for a license, they approve it. And they don't have any examples of where they've not granted a license. So we do not have a high degree of confidence in the CNSC. There's also other reasons. The CNSC, that's the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, they have a philosophy which is called that they are a non-prescriptive regulator. Non-prescriptive means they don't tell the industry what to do. If the industry proposes something, they don't say, well, we don't like that idea, why don't you do this instead? They don't do that. They say if the industry proposes something, that's the plan we will look at. And so the industry is in the driver's seat. And the regulator is only going to back it up. Time's up, is it?
No, it's 20 minutes, so just...
20 minutes. Okay, so let me just tighten up the presentation here because Bernane has a lot to say about what's going on across the border in Ontario. What I want to say is that they built a shaft here in Quebec, and due to the efforts of people like Anne Lindsay and her comrades in the Concerned Citizens Committee of Manitoba, they got the government of Manitoba to pass a law, the only province in Canada that's passed a law against the permanent disposal of radioactive waste in this province, high-level radioactive waste. So that's why that's why when the Nuclear Waste Management Organization was looking for candidate communities, they avoided Manitoba. They also avoided Quebec, because although Quebec does not have a law against it, they have a unanimous resolution, unanimous. This is unheard of in Quebec. Nothing is ever unanimous in Quebec. They have a unanimous resolution of the National Assembly that they will never accept radioactive waste permanent disposal in Quebec. Now, of course, you could say, well, that's just the NIMBY syndrome, not in my backyard. But let me just say a few more things, and then we'll turn it over to Bernane. First of all, the government of Manitoba was persuaded by its citizenry to pass a law prohibiting the permanent disposal. But it's right across the border. And the distance across the border to Kenora, for example, is about equal to the distance from Pinawa. So, and it's right in the heart of Treaty 3 territory in Ontario, a little further inland, that this waste repository is possibly being located. Now, the important thing to realize, and this is something that gets too technical to cover in a few sentences, but we have some handouts. If you help yourself to handouts, I've got educational resources on nuclear waste. I have a nuclear map of Canada, which goes with the glossary of icons. So if you take the map, take the glossary too, because otherwise the two are incomplete without the other. Humpty and Dumpty. Anyway, what people don't quite understand is that the fuel bundles are only about the size of a fireplace log. And they are often portrayed as this is the nuclear waste. This is the nuclear waste, the fuel bundle. But actually, that's not correct. The fuel bundle is the container of the nuclear waste. When the container is damaged, the nuclear waste escape. They leak out. And this happens during normal operation. Inside a nuclear reactor, there's a small number of fuel bundles that get damaged. They call fuel failures. And that radioactive material gets out into the cooling water and circulates and contaminates the whole piping system. And so these 100-ton steam generators, which are far removed from where the fuel is, become radioactive because of radioactive material being carried by the water. So it's the containers that we're talking about. Now when those containers, and they can't put those containers underground until they've cooled off for at least 30 years, because otherwise they're too hot. And too hot means they could boil water. Boiling water means you could create steam. That's a problem. So they have to wait 30 years before putting it underground. But underground, and in the process of getting it underground, you could do more damage. Every time you physically damage the fuel bundles, you create a pathway for escape of the radioactive materials. And as a result, the most damage, the places where they most get rid of the damage to fuel is in places called reprocessing plants. Reprocessing plants. Now what is a reprocessing plant? A reprocessing plant is a plant where you take those fuel bundles and you get the plutonium out of the fuel bundle. Now in the old days they did this primarily to make nuclear weapons. But nowadays they're thinking of using that plutonium as fuel for nuclear reactors. They're saying, wouldn't it be good to get the plutonium out of those fuel bundles before we bury the rest of the crap so that we can use it for fuel. The problem is you cannot get the plutonium out of the fuel bundle without destroying the fuel bundle. And when you destroy the fuel bundle, you release all those radioactive materials that are released in only tiny amounts when you don't destroy it. As a result, the places on Earth where they have had a lot of experience with reprocessing are among the most radioactively contaminated places on Earth. One of them, I looked it up just yesterday. You can check it yourself, go and Google it. It's the cost of cleanup for a site called Hanford in Washington State. Has anybody heard of Hanford? They have millions of gallons of high-level radioactive liquid waste. Why? Because they had to destroy the fuel bundles to get the plutonium out, and that converted the waste into a liquid form, which is now in these huge tanks, some of which have leaked. There's been over 1 million gallons that have leaked into the soil. And so that becomes irrecoverable. That becomes very difficult to get it back again. You know, once it's out there, how do you get it back? How do you clean it up? We just heard recently about the Grassy Narrows band across the border in Ontario complaining about mercury that has been a long-going problem for a long time, and the Government of Canada has done nothing about it. Well, that's the kind of thing we're worried about with regard to high-level radioactive waste. Is that, you know, when it leaks out, it's bad. And we hope it doesn't. Both us, the industry, everybody else hopes it doesn't. But hope is not enough to base a strategy on. Hope is not enough to protect people in the environment. So we believe that putting this stuff beyond human control, i.e. abandoning it, is wrong. It's both scientifically wrong and ethically wrong. And my organization, the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, recommends that as long as the government shows no sign of getting rid of this waste, stopping the production of this waste, there should be no abandonment of it either. And they should have a policy of rolling stewardship. That means keeping it on site, looking after it, making very good, sturdy packages as they do, and repackaging when necessary. But that's something that is a never-ending prospect. But the point is that if they put it underground, they don't put it all underground, because they keep on building more reactors. And so they're always going to be producing more waste at the surface. And around every reactor, there was going to be 30 years worth of irradiated fuel sitting there at the surface, no matter how fast they bury the old stuff. So from that point of view, you could say that this is not a solution, but rather it is the appearance of a disappearance. It's the appearance of a disappearance. The stuff is not disappearing. They have no intention of making it disappear. They have no intention of getting it all off the surface. They just want to have 30 years worth at every operating nuclear reactor at the surface. Well, I'm sorry, that doesn't really make the planet that much safer. So in my personal opinion, and the opinion of many of my colleagues, we feel that this is fundamentally, it's a conflicted enterprise. It's got a conflict of interest. We had hundreds of groups across Canada participating in a government policy of writing a new radioactive waste policy for Canada. And we had a large degree of unanimity. I wouldn't say it's 100% unanimous, but very close, that there should be an independent agency devoted only to the radioactive waste in terms of health and environment, and no connections to the nuclear industry. And by the way, that is the unanimous recommendation of the Seaborn panel, which is the 10-year environmental assessment panel that looked at this idea of geological disposal. Unanimously, they recommended that the Government of Canada should have an independent agency with stakeholders on the board of directors. That would include Indigenous leaders as well. on the board of directors. They should be the ones who make the decisions as to what is being done in the best interest of the health and safety of Canadians and the environment, not the nuclear industry. And now I'll turn this over to Renee. Thank you so much for your attention.